think we're probably ready to begin. So Jeanne, welcome.
Thank you.
Everyone who might be watching, I am Stuart Horodner, the director of the UK Art Museum. I'm happy to have you join us tonight. I'm very happy to be seeing artist Jeanne Silverthorne, who obviously has a solo exhibit here at the museum called More Flesh and Bone, which opened a few weeks ago. And, you know, let me just say up front, I'm quite sad that we haven't had the ability to do all of this in the flesh, you know, that in a sense, the exhibit is here and we installed it without Jeanne, that we're doing all of this via Zoom, but at the same time, we're hoping that people are, you know, staying safe and being sane. And we're just happy to be providing a conversation to extend the thoughts of the exhibit. So Jeanne, thank you. I thought I would start really with a very brief bio if you want to know more about Jeanne and her work. Obviously, a quick Google search will bring up all kinds of information and imagery. It is staggering to me that I have known Jeanne's work and her for just about 30 years. I don't know where all that time went, but during that process, she has been mining the studio, not just as a place to go and make things, but a place to go and contemplate the nature of making and the site of that space where things are tried and processes are explored and objects get completed or destroyed. She's made work that is both seemingly very available and candid and accessible, and at the same time, to my mind, has made those same objects feel surreal and surprising. She has like numerous exhibits, solo shows at galleries around the United States, at prestigious museums, including the Whitney, the Phillips Collection, PS1 in New York, the ICA in Philadelphia. Her work's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, the MFA in Houston, SF MoMA, amongst others. She's received numerous awards, including the Guggenheim, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, a National Endowment for the Arts grant. And equally important, I think she has been a dedicated teacher at both Columbia University in the early 2000s, the Maine College of Art, and for many years now has been on the faculty at the School of Visual Arts in New York. So I'm really excited to be able to talk with you about what you've been up to for these couple of decades, and talk about process and things that are finished, things that are unfinished. And let's take it where we've known each other for a while. I think we trust each other and we can just go where it feels right to go. But certainly we want to give people a sense of this exhibit. And so maybe we just dive right in. Does that sound good?
Yep, sure.
I'm looking at you on the screen, but I probably should just stay looking forward. Again, let me say two pieces of housekeeping. One is that for people who are joining us, if you have questions for us, which we'll take at the end of our session, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please put any questions you have in that Q&A area. And as always, I want to thank my colleague, Dan Solberg, who is our education coordinator, who's kind of the invisible hand helping us move through these images and tech tonight. So thanks, Dan. We're looking at an installation view here of the exhibit, whose title is More Flesh and Bone. Jeanne, might you want to say something about the title?
Yeah, sure. It's actually a reference to a Samuel Beckett quote. And I'm going to try to see if I can remember it correctly. It's something like, some see the flesh before the bone. Some see the bones before the flesh. Some never see the bones at all. And some never see the flesh at all. Never, never see the flesh at all. And I think it's important to remember that Samuel Beckett was one of our great humorists. So, obviously I have long been interested in flesh and bone in my work. So, and also Samuel Beckett has, as for virtually every artist I know, been a great reference. So that's where the title literally comes from.
Got it. Well, one of the things that we can talk about is actual flesh, implied flesh, when a material seems like it might be one thing, but could also be a surrogate for flesh. Let's take a look. Dan can bring us in to look at the work that's here in the installation shot on the left, a work called Unstrung, in parentheses, Puppet Me, which will give us a chance to maybe talk about a few things. So this is indeed a very minuscule self-portrait. And what one immediately sees here is the nature of the materials, the kind of finesse that Jeanne brings to working with materials, but also something that in the shot on the right is worth pointing out. Here we're seeing a seemingly wooden crate, which is sitting on our floor, which is made of end grain upended wood. And the crate is serving as the pedestal or presentation space for this small self-portrait. And the small sculpture, the self-portrait, indeed comes shipped in the crate itself. So it's both practical as well as kind of philosophical or conceptual, this notion of, rendering a crate as well as using the rendered crate for said function. So, Jeanne, maybe you could talk a little bit about representing yourself in this rather unstrung and discombobulated way, and anything else you might like to say about the making of this work.
Sure. I've said this so often that I don't want to, I hope I'm not going to bore people with this sort of preface, but, part of my investigation into the studio has been constructed around the notion that it's dilapidated, that it's a ruin, that it's archaic, that it's a place of discomfort in the 21st century, and indeed was already so at the end of the 20th century. And so, it was the residence of privilege. It was, for so long, especially from the 19th century on, it was the place for the romantically isolated white male genius. So what do you do if the studio is also, in Virginia Woolf's term, a room of your own? How do you reconcile the pleasure and desire for that with the fact that you don't feel quite at home in the history of this studio? So I thought, well, one of the things you can do is you can treat it like an archaeological site. You can inventory it, you can excavate it, you can salvage it by documenting its ruin, if you will. So this is a long way of getting around to saying, so that one of the things I began to document was not just the infrastructure of the studio, copying its innards, its wires, its plumbing, all of which was dilapidated anyway, or as of 2007, starting to talk about the things that you don't see in the world that are in the studio, that are hidden in deep storage, by making these functional crates so that the work actually, gets stored in them, gets shipped out in them, and they become, as you said, part of the exhibition. They become a sculpture themselves. But as for the representation of myself, I'm part of the inventory. That is, it is of course a self-portrait, but it's also a portrait of the artist. And it's a deeply anti-heroic portrait. And so there've been a lot of these sort of avatars of the studio coming out that are very much a critique of that cult of the genius. And this is a body that has been, in a Frankensteinian way, dismembered and sewn back together again. It's a portrait of myself, literally, in that I took a photograph of myself from many angles. I modeled it in clay using magnifying lenses and sewing needles for tools. I cast it. I made a mold, I cast it in rubber, I put in phosphorescent pigment. Many pieces that I make glow in the dark, although you would never know it unless you happen to be around when the lights go out. So it's another kind of invisibility. And then I actually put some of my own hair on it after casting it in rubber, and cut it up, and then sewed it together with these puppet-like strings that also glow in the dark, and put it on a miniature facsimile of the chair that I actually use in the studio. This something called a task chair, if you go to Staples and try to buy it. And that kind of chair appears over and over and over again in my work. So I don't know, there are many different ways that I make things. I mean, I just described one of my favorite methods, which is to start by modeling in clay and make a mold, and then pour in the rubber and add a pigment, usually phosphorescence. But for the crates, for instance, carpentry is involved, because although the rubber that covers the wooden infrastructure, which you need, otherwise it can't function, is poured and drawn. That is, it's kind of drawing. I'll have, say, a sheet of plexiglass, draw the wood grain in rubber in one color, maybe more wood grain in a different color, and then pour a background color. When I pull it up, I have the wood grain rubber that gets applied to the wooden infrastructure. So that's very different than modeling in clay, making a mold, although it's still very hand and this time involves drawing rather than shaping.
Yeah, I think the time and process element of your work, and certainly we can get into that as we look at other things, but I think there's this for many years, the nature of not just what you've made, but how you've made it. The same moment you're talking about the nature of the studio as a kind of model for a space, but also this question of labor, the labor intensity of making the things that you've made, the depths to which you've gone to cast things, and have those things be things we know from the regular world, light bulbs, chandeliers, electrical hardware, things that are so familiar, but on the one level, you've gone through these amazingly lengthy procedures to create them in industrial materials.
Yeah, labor intensive is my second name, I guess. And I guess obviously there's a deep pleasure for me in that. I wouldn't do it otherwise. In making things, in detail work, in putting things together, using my hands, basically. So
is there also something about the sort of extended time that requires that you like, relative to, waiting for something to cure, having time to think about it? Can you talk a little bit about the relationship of the, not only the extensive labor, but the time and what that time gives you when you're in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. I was trained as a painter, as so many people my age were, especially women. There weren't even any sculpture courses offered for women when I was in school. So I had to sort of teach myself sculpture. At any rate, I was a terrible painter. And one of the reasons there were probably many that I was a terrible painter was that it was too fast for me. I have, I tend to like overthink things. My brain goes a mile a minute. I get too many ideas, and then in a painting, you can the time between the idea and something happening is too fast. So the thing about sculpture is that I may have a million ideas, and I'm trying to stuff them all into this one piece, but it takes so goddamn long to make it that by the time I get through step one, things have sifted themselves out. They've simplified themselves. Just through the duration of time. So time is like a kind of slowing down of my decision-making process, which in my case is a very, very good thing. So although there are people who may feel that the work is still like overly complicated, all I can say is it would be much, much, much worse if it didn't take me forever to make something. It's an editing process. Time is an editing process. Also, time is all we've got. As long as we're mortal, that's all we've got is
Mhm.
time. And so, in a perhaps, kind of neurotic way, I somewhere deeply believe, I guess, that spending time is an act of devotion. It's spending time is how you put something, how you earn a work.
Mhm.
That's not to say that I don't think an amazing work can be made just like that. And I've done that myself, just like that. It doesn't matter, in terms of the quality judgment you may make about your work. Some things happen very quickly. That's not the issue, but the issue is somewhere along the lines of, in general, I
Mhm.
feel I need to put in the hours, I need to earn, it's about earning something.
Mhm.
But it's also about a deep, deep pleasure, always knowing that it takes me out of my head too, the doing. The
Mhm.
doing takes me out of my head. There's a lot of repetitive, you know, tasks involved. And that's very soothing to me.
Yeah. Yeah, let's move on to, let's look at crates with skeletons. A little bit larger work, a little more, which is, again, you get a sense of the relative scale of these works from that first installation shot. Um, I guess maybe I would ask you a question about this from a couple of different angles. The provisional nature of the collapsed crate, and it really is collapsed in terms of when one sets it up, has to get it just right for it to sit there. And that rubber is, literally such a fluid, almost cartoony material in your hands, but also the dangling skeletons, the provisional nature, the delicacy of this tableau, for lack of a better word. So I want to ask you about that, the kind of that tender but also conditional relationship between things. I think, we have a little video of just how and this is dangling from, a kind of almost invisible fishing line, but they spin slightly. And these are two skeletons, in an embrace that seems very tender, and yet they're wearing boxing gloves. Um, Anything you'd like to jump off from?
Yeah. Let me address the collapsing crate too. I mean, in general, from the beginning of this attention to the ruined studio starting in the 80s, I've been talking about a state of collapse. Everything is collapsing. Everything is falling apart. Eventually, in my sort of imagination, the walls of the studio have collapsed and nature starts to come in at a certain point, but we can
Mhm.
talk more about that later on. So I think I was feeling that the crates should collapse too. I mean, in a way, the crates were sort of the exception to the general um, um, fragility fragility of the rest of the work, in that they were sturdy and they were functional, and they had to be in order to carry out the jobs I wanted them to carry out. But my early visions of crates in relation to the works were those kinds of crushed fruit crates you find in open air markets and things like that. So this is a crate that's collapsing too. And it really, as you say, you really have to, it's rubber, so it wobbles, and you really have to find just the right place to put that one supporting slat, and kind of wiggle the rest of it into place, or it won't look the way it's supposed to look. And it literally could, if you let it go, collapse into almost one dimension. So, that just goes hand in hand with the general notion of dilapidation and ruin, and how of fragility. We're very fragile creatures and we don't last long. And all human endeavor, no matter how successful, ultimately ends in a kind of extinction. It's not a very fun point of view, but I think it's a fact that no one can deny, although we don't necessarily always want to have it shoved into our faces. So the two skeletons, of course, I mean, we all know that love and death are two sides of the same coin, as are love and hate. I don't see these people as fighting each other at all, though. I see them as fighting mortality. I see this as a very loving image. And it's interesting because I actually made way back again in the 80s, a very large kind of homunculus figure with also rubber boxing gloves on it. So that's another image that's been with me, or a contradiction, if you will, that's been with me for a long, long time. You know, it takes effort to stay alive. It takes effort to stay connected. It's kind of a doomed effort, except it's not, because I don't know, because we keep fighting and we keep connecting. I mean, I don't think that I really need to say too much about this.
No, let me ask you, was the notion, let's say, of the, I mean, because that fruit crate, or that you know, the collapsed crate, is another reference to the body. I mean, it's not odd for me to imply or say outright that, you know, those slats do feel like ribs, and you're then looking at the ribs of the skeleton.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you, I mean, are you thinking at any point in some of this about sculptural legacies? I mean, does Brancusi come into this at any moment in terms of the setup and the staging of, you know, the notion of not a benign pedestal, but an active pedestal?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can't have come into the art world at the time that I did without the notion of the base being an issue. I mean, yes, first there was Brancusi, who made the base part of the sculpture, and that was so revolutionary. And then there's Carl Andre, who made the base the entire sculpture in those flat floor tiles. And so, you know, the whole vexation notion of the base, you know, do you have a base? Do you not have a base? You know, has, you know, plagued me as much as any other sculptor, until one day, as I said, about, well, 2007 or so, for some reason I decided to start making these functional crates, and the whole problem seemed solved. It also, of course, has a lot to do with references to Judd, who is not somebody I feel allegiance to. I've always felt opposed to Judd. So this is my kind of conversation with him, if you will.
Would you feel closer? And some of this is fun for me because we've never talked about this stuff, although I've thought it in my own time away from you. Would you feel closer to somebody like Oldenburg?
Yeah, you know, I love Oldenburg's work, but I never think of him in relation to my work, except in the sense that, except in this sense, I've always been very interested in shifting scales, so that small things get enlarged, microscopic things get big. You can't see it in this exhibition, but again, for decades, I've been picking up little scraps of debris from the studio floor that are left over from the casting process and enlarging them so that they look like abstract art, for instance. Conversely, I'll take big things and make them quite tiny. And for me, that's about issues of power. Because when we look at something that's small, we feel we have power over it. We feel we have control. And as the abstract expressionists recognize, when something is bigger than we are lost in relation to it. That has more. So I like putting people in different roles, putting the audience in different roles, so you can go from one position to another. Oldenburg doesn't do that. Oldenburg is interested in taking the ordinary and blowing it up. And I find that, you know,
or making something hard into something soft.
Or hard into soft. Yeah, that I can certainly relate to. But in terms of the blow-ups, I think it's one of the reasons why I've always resisted blowing anything up too largely, because that wasn't a place I wanted to go to. But certainly the notion of scale, ordinary objects and scale, he's not somebody who occupies a huge amount of space in my head, but he's somebody clearly I have thought of.
it begs me to want to ask you about, another guy, although I'll just do it anyway, which is, something like Jasper Johns. And we could talk about Louise Bourgeois, Neva Hesse, and anybody else that you'd like to, reference. Can you just talk in general about being of a particular generation of American sculptors, women sculptors? What do you feel like your relationship is to sculptural legacy, either 20th century or more specifically end of 20th century, process, minimalism? I mean, just how do you think about your inheritance of some of those traditions and relationships to specific people?
Well, this will probably be a little bit meandering, but I grew up in Philadelphia, so I of course saw all of John's sculpt metal pieces, and they were so wonderful to me. I'm not a painter, so though I like John's paintings, they don't, I don't have any conversation with them. But those little objects, I think anyone can see how influential they were, especially on my earlier work. So there's that. I already talked about, my reaction to minimalism in the form of people like Judd and things like that. That was, interesting to me because it was the major dialogue. It was intellectually interesting, but I felt, I felt excluded. I felt it was, not congenial to me. There's been a lot of feminist critique of that work, and that resonates with me for sure, absolutely. But then along comes post-minimalism in the form of people like Eva Hesse, for instance. And, we all fell in love with that work. And she was a woman. And that was amazing. Oddly enough, Louise Bourgeois was somebody I came to know slightly later when she had her first major retrospective. So in between sort of, you have to understand, I was just a kid in Philadelphia, kind of reading these things in the library, right? I remember wandering into the library and there was this shelf full of things, something called Art Forum. And I pulled it off the shelf and I opened it up and there was an article on Encore. I could not understand a word of it, but I thought, wow, this is really intellectually challenging. This is not just about, making stuff and is it good? It was really stimulating. And then I think the coup de grace was that in the early 70s, again, I was still a student, I went to an exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia by Ree Morton.
I knew you were going to say, I was just going to ask you about Ree Morton. That's great.
And it was called Sister Perpetua's Lie. I didn't know anything about Ree Morton. Hardly anybody did at that point. I mean, some people did, obviously, but she was hardly a household name. And Sister Perpetua's Lie was this installation that was an environment and that led you from one place to another. It had kind of handmade, hand-sawn wooden elements. It had raw canvas tacked to the wall with drawings that were sort of schematic and, and basically the whole thing was a literary reference to Raymond Rousseau's novel. I just thought, oh my God, I didn't know, again, what it meant, but I just responded to the intimation of meaning in connection with so much of the raw sculptural hand quality of it, the intimacy of it, and the mystery of it. And so I thought, okay, so this is it. I'm for sure going to be an artist because art can do something that at that point I thought nothing else could do, which is it could be, it could be emotional, it could be psychological, it could be intellectual, it could be mysterious, it could encompass anything, literature, physics, you name it. And I would say that exhibition, that work, and the rest of her work, especially the first half of her work, which is more sculptural, perhaps. Well, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the first half of her 5-year body of work that we know was incredibly influential for me, and I just responded to it enormously. And of course, she was a woman, smart, risk-taking, weird, eccentric
Mhm.
woman. Not personally, I never met her.
Yeah. No, I saw, I think the first time I came across that work was a show in New York in the late 70s, which may have been at the New School. I'm trying to think of it, or the New Museum in its, maybe its first iteration. I don't remember, but I had a very powerful reaction to that. Again, usually from a point of view of, I don't understand this, but it's doing something to me.
Yeah.
And I can't quite just, shake that, the joy of that. I think there's a good segue here if we go over to look at the work that's called Crates with Fallen Lights and Svivo's Pencil, because I do want to ask you, and this maybe is the most, other than the unstrung you, the puppet you, the collapsed you, this might be the work in the show that has the most immediate relationship to previous work that has that sense of, a system in ruination or materials which have been, fallen and tangled and kind of in a state of collapse. But it also lets us talk about, literature and your relationship to writing, because the pencil there, the kind of worm-covered pencil, which you're referencing in the title as Svivo's Pencil, is a reference to the Italian writer Italo Svivo. And maybe you can talk a little bit about literature or critical writing or feminist writing that's been important to you.
Yeah, or yes, absolutely, I'd love to.
Or anything else you want to say.
So you're right, this is yet another scene of collapse. It's got the ubiquitous rubber light bulb, which started occurring in my work as soon as I started inventorying the studio and its infrastructure. And of course, the hanging bare light bulb is, the emblem of the studio in paintings by Picasso, Philip Guston, and you see it in photographs of Giacometti's studio. So it's almost the iconic studio light bulb. It's also anachronistic at this point. And my light bulbs, not only are they non-functional, sometimes they were black, but even this one, it glows in the dark, but it doesn't give off any light. It only takes in light. And it's collapsed here. So, and for me, ideas, light bulbs are ideas, illumination. It's the cartoon notion of got an idea, the light bulb goes on over your head, all of that. So it's also about the collapse of rationality in a way, or the collapse of intellection, or a bad idea, a failed idea, which brings me to the pencil and to the reference to literature. And to Svivo's novel, The Confessions of Zeno. The title is the only clue to that, of course, but it's a pencil, and as you say, it's covered with worms. I won't go into great detail about this wonderful novel, except to say that a lot of it is about how, as the writer says, he writes, "We lie with every word we write in the Tuscan language." And I'm paraphrasing now, but he says something like, any confession, any sort of confession, let me see if I've got it here. A written confession is always mendacious. In other words, language is a lie. And in fact, it turns out his whole diary, a journal is declared a lie by his therapist. So it's all about how language is basically untrustworthy, which is where the worms come into the pencil. Mm-hmm. And I'm belaboring this because on the one hand, I genuinely, strongly feel that the body with its viscera and its guts is and its pain and its grief and its loss and its fragility, its vulnerability is kind of what we all have in common. It's mortality, basically. And I know that this is politically at this point, a view that can easily be challenged and should be challenged. And there's pain that is incommensurate with other people's pain. Just because you have pain doesn't mean that you're the same as people who have had greater pain and greater losses. The Politics of Viscerality, as Mbembe talks about it when he's talking about Frantz Fanon and South African politics, involves, as he says, a kind of disconnection. It's not about universality. It's not about connection. It's about you either have had enough pain to be in that club or you haven't. And Mbembe rejects that politics of viscerality. And he trusts, he says, in a politics of transfiguration through language. I guess I find myself in some place that's much more ambivalent. I trust viscerality. I trust the body. I trust what I think is contrary to what, might be politically more acceptable at the moment. I trust the universality of pain, even though I know that people suffer more and people suffer less. But everybody knows pain at some point, everybody knows grief, everybody knows death at some point. So it's something that you can trust to a certain degree, in a way that I don't trust entirely rationality, or let's call it language, the language of reason, entirely, because, the Enlightenment led to the excesses of the guillotine, because, excessive rationality led to the atom bomb and to genetic, we know this story, right? Sort of Adorno said, every thought is a kind of violence, right? On the other hand, I don't trust irrationality either. And language is interesting. How do I know what I think till I hear what I say? Language is also creative. Language is poetry. Language is description. Language is also connection. But it's tricky and it's not reliable, and I don't entirely trust it. And so that's where I find myself, in this very ambivalent relationship. And it shouldn't even be, I don't think it is, this dichotomy between body and language. For me, everything is kind of organic. Language is organic, ideas are organic, and all of that. But for purposes of discussion, let's just split them apart for a moment.
There is something that seems also happening here, which, you mentioned collapse, you mentioned politics. It feels also like what's being said here, as well as a rather cynical or potentially untrusting relationship to systems, to political systems, or to order, or to, I'm thinking right now, obviously, your exhibit, which I, wanted to present, very much is an exhibit that's being shown at the edge of another exhibit, which is called This is America, which is a group show about an attempt to look at, the state of the country and all of its contradictions and promises. And so, a collapsed tangle of lights on the crate with the pencil, with the worms, also feels like maybe we can't trust the things that we've been able to trust before or thought we could trust. And so there is this tension, that's in this work. And it's also a good segue to another work, which I, certainly want to talk about. And maybe we'll just look at the other work, which is called Top of the World, which also feels like it jumps from, and we're bypassing here, hanging light and edgy, just for the sake of time. This work, Top of the World, feels like a natural extension of what we're talking about, which is ways of understanding, a very large condition. In this case, you're using a globe. The globe is spinning as the video is not just the camera moving, but the globe is literally spinning, and the flies and skeletons that are atop it are moving very slowly. Here, there does feel like, a move out to use an object like that, to choose to put, to choose to make unbelievably delicate, beautifully rendered, realistic flies, as well as the skeletons. this feels like it has some of the qualities that you were just describing.
Yeah, I mean, to get back to your comment about not trusting systems, I guess if we were to say that I think that I have no belief in authority,
Yeah.
that would be maybe truer or more to the point in terms of how I think. And what else do I say? I guess the other thing I wanted to say is that, the studio I've often talked about as this place where, there's privacy and where you go inward, right? And in that sense, it's like a room of one's own, okay? But as I also said, in its dilapidation, the walls are falling apart. If you want to imagine it in a kind of literal way, and nature is moving in, hence all these flies, and the survivors of the natural world start moving and the flies start coming in, the weeds coming up through the cracks in the floorboards, etc. And in a way, the world comes in, which is why this is a globe. The world comes in. And it's another reason why the occupant of the studio starts to lose her boundaries, because as boundaries collapse, so do the boundaries of the self. And you become dismembered, or at one point I did a self-portrait of myself as a fly with eyeglasses, or as a sunflower hanging itself from the noose of a bulb. I mean, the borders of self-identity, the borders of your own body, once the borders and walls of the studio have collapsed, mix with the world. So, yeah, that's why this is a globe. I think I'm going to stop talking because I've sort of lost my train of thought. I'm going to let you ask another question.
Okay, well, I think we can go to an image which we added very late in the game here to talk about how sometimes a work which has all of its own internal rationales and experiences speaks to us as art, and obviously within a history of your own production. But something happened a few weeks ago that made this work all of a sudden seem very different. And I thought we could show that image, which is from the vice presidential debate when the fly landed on Mike Pence's head and stayed there for quite a while. The day after that evening dialogue between Pence and Kamala Harris, coming into the museum the next morning and talking with you or texting you and sending images like this around, it felt like the sculpture just took on an entirely different mood for a moment or two. When did you see this fly on Pence's head? What did it make you think about? How do you understand moments like this when they happen around your work?
Well, I saw it when everybody else did, of course. And yeah, I've made so many flies. I had 120 handmade flies on a wall once. I've made so many flies for so many years that, of course, I'm going to relate to this. But what I was mainly struck by was what proof this was of how insensate Pence is, that he couldn't even feel that there was a live being on his head. That's how insensate he is. But at any rate, so it's quite funny, of course. We were all riveted. It's hilarious. But what's interesting is how that now, the fly is a political icon. And for me,
let's get rid of Mike for a minute, though. Let's go back to the installation shot if we can.
Okay.
Maybe Dan can pull that up just so we're not spending a lot of time talking over the vice president.
Well, I think the flies have always been, for me, in a funny way, political, in the sense that they've always been about this sort of, threat of dissolution. If I say I'm anti-authoritarian, the fly is the sign of, the thing that comes in, the gadfly. What's a gadfly? A gadfly is that which, bites livestock and makes you, annoyed and stings you and criticizes you. So, in that sense, it always had, if you will, at least vaguely a political dimension. I think of, for instance, Beelzebub as the fly, the defiant angel, and look at the fly. On the one hand, there's Emily Dickinson's "I heard a fly buzz when I died." On the other hand, there's Descartes, who's lying in bed one day, sees a fly on the ceiling, and realizes that if he uses the four corners of the room, he can invent the Cartesian coordinate system. It's already politicized, if you know what I mean, even in terms of gender, okay? And it's also not just, I mean, for me, things are never just one thing. A fly may be a sign of dissolution. It's also a sign of survival and life. It persists. And flies may seem to be about garbage, and often they are attracted to a mess, to shit. But believe it or not, flies are also, like bees, pollinators sometimes for certain kinds of flowers. So I don't know. And the other thing, I don't know how much time we have, but it struck me funny because, again, not in this show, but lately I've been using a kind of feminized image of Wile E. Coyote, the cartoon character. It's Wile E. Coyote with breasts. I've used it 4 times as yet another one of these self-portraits that are anti-heroic and anti-genius, because who could be stupider as an occupant of the studio than Wile E. Coyote? And then the New Yorker just ran this hilarious article on Wile E. Coyote as a Republican strategist, advising the Republicans that they should be more like him. Gun control, yes, and more bombs. Well, have you tried painting a hole in the a tunnel-like image on the mountainside so you can run into it and flatten yourselves completely? And so suddenly Wile E. Coyote, who was not a political image at all, is, at least for this one moment in time, politicized. And that, again, it's like thin walls between the private and the public, very thin walls. It's almost a kind of transparency between the two. So, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yes, it does. I think I'm going to see if since we got about 12 minutes left in our promised end date of 7, let's see if we've got folks in our chat, or if anybody would like to put questions in our Q&A. Okay, my colleague Mia Cinelli said, "Thank you for sharing your work with us. Would you elaborate on material histories in your work, real or imagined?"
Could I just ask for a clarification of what you mean by real or imagined? Is that possible?
Let's see if Mia can type her answer. Rubber versus wood.
Oh, okay, I understand now, yeah. We're talking about trompe-l'oeil here, basically. So let me first talk about the material of rubber, which, is an addiction. What can I tell you? I started out using plaster mainly, which I still love. It's a wonderful material, but it was heavy and it broke. And one day I went into the art supply store and there was some latex, and I poured it into a mold I had, and voila, that's it. I was hooked. And every time, and believe me, it's been 35 years of using all different kinds of rubber. I have tried and tried and tried to use other materials, and they never satisfy me. And I have gone through every kind of rubber there was. First, latex, which is a perfectly material. It's just the sap of the rubber tree. You can even get it from dandelions. There are a lot of dandelions in my work, by the way. But then, of course, I was taken to task and made to feel a little bit ashamed because latex allegedly was not archival. People can make you feel really bad about those things. Even though, as it turns out, I found a way by adding shredded cloth and acrylic paint to make almost all of my latex pieces last, so they're still around. But it drove me into industrial rubbers that were very bad in many ways. One of them had something called cold flow. This was called black tuffy, or a polysulfide rubber. I didn't cast this myself because it was toxic, and I didn't even have a window. I would give the mold to a foundry. And then the problem with that is this cold flow is basically the fact that over time, gravity affects this kind of rubber. And so eventually it just does this, which I've tried to sort of salvage also by recasting those in a better rubber so that I have a kind of before and after. But anyway, then I moved on to a more stable rubber that I could use myself, UV urethane rubber, but it was filled with all kinds of problems too, because it didn't take pigment, it changed color, You couldn't adhere rubber to rubber once it was cast. It was very problematic. So finally, I came to platinum silicone rubber, which is what I've been using for a long, long time now, which is non-toxic, apparently indestructible, and lasts forever, which maybe these days we really don't want, I don't know. And for me, technically, it was liberating because you can attach one silicone rubber piece to another with more silicone rubber. So I could have an additive process, which really changed my work. Before I had to model everything in clay and in one mold. I could pour different colors into the mold, but I couldn't attach anything. And so a lot of the labor intensive stuff of like the flies, for instance, couldn't have been done. You know, I have to attach each wing with a little silicone rubber. That couldn't have been done with the other rubbers whatsoever. I couldn't have the phosphorescence as a pigment because it would have faded, or it had to overcome a rubber that was already in the UV rubber. So and that's the history of the rubber material. As I said, it's an addiction. I mean, it's like flesh. It's got an inherent humor because it's sort of disobedient. It's floppy. If you don't put an infrastructure into it or an armature, it'll just collapse. Speaking of collapse, it has no spine. In that sense, it doesn't take orders. It also has an industrial vibe. So it has all these, as just sort of, you know, kind of levels of association. It evokes different things. And then to the question of trompe l'oeil, why go to all the trouble of using this material to make it look like, say, wood? Like that crate is rubber, why the collapsing crate is rubber, why do that? That's a different issue. And not everything I do is trompe l'oeil, but I do a lot of that. And I think, first of all, in a very simple way, there's a kind of pleasure we get still, even now, out of things that look like something else. That is, you know, that fool you. That's what trompe l'oeil, it fools the eye, right? But also, I think it's more about kind of a slight displacement. It's the real thing, but it's not the real thing. It's that tiny space between a real wooden crate and a crate that sure looks like it, but, you know, doesn't feel like it, doesn't, you know, it just isn't the same thing at all. So that's kind of interesting to me. I think I have more to say about trompe l'oeil that I said recently, but I can't remember what it was.
Well, let's see how you handle a question from Saul Ostro. I should say, I'm pretty sure, as I recall, that Saul introduced me to you and your work many years ago. So thank you, Saul. Jeanne, can you speak a bit about your work's relationship to history? The idea that the crates preserve and hold in reserve the work for some future moment.
Yes, but do they, is the question. This is the big question. So, you know, I've been obsessed with storage always, as part of the things, you know, things that are in storage are invisible. You know, they're hidden away. They're behind the scenes. So, you know, the sort of, if you will, the pictures of invisibility, you know, bubble wrapped objects, canvases, chairs, which are in fact rubber, more trompe l'oeil, but look like they're bubble wrapped, have been around again in my work since the late 80s, early 90s. But you're right, Saul, the crates are different in that they're functional. So they really do, you know, hold stuff and store stuff. And, you know, they're relatively, I mean, the silicone rubber is made to last, and the crates are made of wood and made to last. And that's true, but all I can tell you is that I have no belief that anything will last. And so for me, it's less a matter of storing them up for history, which I have no faith in. But I can't see that. I don't, my mind doesn't go those places. The future for me is like, not even tomorrow is scary for me. I don't think of those things. What I think of is while I'm alive, where will I find the space for these things? And after I die, how can I make it easy for my family to locate things? And then what's going to happen? I have no idea, but I certainly don't you just have to take my word for it, that it's really more about a kind of obsessive compulsive interest in compact storage than it is about preserving things for history. That is something that's out of my hands. I can't imagine it. I can't plan for it. And everyone I know, most of the artists I know are in the same position. It's just like, we just throw up our hands. Like, that's not for us to decide, you know.
Jeanne, at any point, have you thought about the crates as coffins?
Yes, I mean, not not consciously at first. And I don't go around thinking about them,
Right.
but yeah, certainly across my mind and across the minds of other people that these were like coffins. Yeah, so I guess it's, it may not be as much preserving as it is literally a coffin that you put in the ground and forget about.
Yeah, but also the idea that they're going to go places, I mean, there's something about the crate as a nature of, you're talking about it in the practical relationship to the studio and storage and all those kinds of things. But there is something to me that's, ultimately optimistic, which is that these things are going to be used for transport opportunities, right? There's a kind of liminal aspect to the crate with the work in there, waiting for the next opportunity, waiting for the next show. So to me, there is a kind of agency, maybe a dormant kind of agency to the crates, and your use of them functionally as, the platform on which other things get presented.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you have that optimistic point of view. I honestly don't think I share that particular optimism, but certainly I agree with you that they solved so many problems. We talked about solving the problem of the base. We talked about other problems that they solve, but also they just literally, there's never enough space. And so in the studio, once I realized that stuff could be put in these things, whether they ever go out to another show again or not, I can stack them up to the fucking ceiling. It creates space for me. It creates space for me, and it organizes things, although it gets a little sloppy sometimes in terms of my knowing what's in what. But yeah, it's about giving me space by putting things in these stackable containers. It's a little bit like, I also had a fetish about Rubbermaid products. So there you are.
Is there anything you want to talk about or reference that we haven't talked about? Any misunderstandings about your work over the years, you think? Have people gotten it right, you think, from generally?
No, I wonder if any artist feels that their work has been gotten right by most people or everybody. No, I often think it's gotten wrong, but mainly I think that's because it's actually quite multiplicitous. I mean, this all looks fairly coherent. We've had a very coherent discussion, but in fact, my work includes videos and fictional letters and photography and performative acts of writing invisible texts. I mean, it's quite multiplicitous, and I think people, with good reason, can be easily confused, for one thing, and for another, who can see the whole range of the work? I mean, people see one show if I'm lucky, or they read one article, or one aspect of the work is what gets repeated, and so they don't even know the full range of what's going on. And then I think that the way that I think about the work, the connections that exist in the work for me, are probably overly dense they're just overly dense, for good or for bad. They're just overly dense. And so for me, there's always a kind of oversimplification of the work. But I think that has to be, it's not the fault of the audience, of their reception. It's kind of the fault of the conditions under which art is shown, the opportunities, that people do and don't have. It's my fault for the way my mind works and the way I operate. It's not a matter of fault, perhaps.
Well, we were also very specific in what we chose, saying we just, literally you and I trying to think about what to show right now, what felt right in dialogue with other things. Maybe one last question. I know we're at 7, and this feels connected to what my colleague Kate Springether has asked, which is how are you, or how do you think your work is responding to the current pandemic and illnesses and deaths and just the state of where we're at. Thoughts on that and relative to the selection of work we're presenting, or things that are going on in your mind in studio right now?
Yeah, well, I've always been death obsessed. All the work is a vanitas, and the studio itself is a memento mori for me. So, it's not so much that my work is now responding to the pandemic as that it's chiming in with what we're all feeling, which is that, we're facing our mortality and we're boxed in, we're packed away. But certainly I'm not making work. First of all, I don't work that fast. So I've only made a few works since the pandemic started, or I've only finished a few works since the pandemic started. I just think that I've always, I think you're either born this way or you aren't, been death obsessed. So, and illness obsessed and concerned with mortality. So it's not specific to the pandemic, but sure
feels right on the money.
Sure has found a match with what's going on right now. Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably the best place for us to end. We could go on doing this because I love talking with you and listening to hear what you have to say about what you make. I want to just thank you, Jeanne, so much for joining us tonight, and for everybody who participated and watched us and played with us, trying to say something about what we do and why we do it and what it means. Thank you very much for everybody joining us. If you're in our area, come see the exhibit and other things we have on view. And as I've been saying almost in every closure of a message or a letter, stay safe and sane out there in these challenging times. But kudos and thanks so much to you, Jeanne.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Yes, it was fun. Take care, everybody.
Great. Thank you all.